Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Andrew Johnson, and the focus is Lincoln's second VP. The year is 1864. Johnson is continuing his role as the military governor of Tennessee, the Civil War now about to go into its fourth year. And Tennessee, mostly in Union control. It's still tenuous. There's still battles, but mostly this is in control of the Union Army. This is tough work. It is perilous work for not only Johnson, for his family. In fact, he lost a son just before this year, his son Charles. This was not in battle. It was kind of a freak accident where he fell off a horse he was riding, hit his head, died instantly. So a tragic moment amongst a whole bunch of other tragedies that Johnson was trying to deal with in this very hard job. Now, nationally, the Civil War also very much in the balance. Now, the Union Army had some significant victories in 1863, but the path to victory was still a little bit unclear. And this was all clouding the election year of 1864 and Abraham Lincoln's attempt to get reelected to make sure that he could finish the job that he believed he was hired to do to squash this rebellion and keep the Union whole. He had attacks from all sides. The Democrats went with George McClellan as their nominee for President of the United States. McClellan was a former Union general. He was nominated on a peace platform. His charge was to try to get to peace with the Confederacy. Lincoln had challenges in his own ranks, though. Lincoln, a Republican, was always part of the moderate wing of the party. There were radicals, so-called radical Republicans in the party that very much differed with Lincoln on what was going to happen after the war. The radicals wanted to punish the South. They wanted to impose new requirements, particularly on how to deal with the free blacks that they were planning to have be free in the post-war environment, and really impose almost a vengeful approach with the South after the war. This was not Lincoln's way. Lincoln wanted a generous set of terms, get the South back into the Union as quickly as possible. In fact, he felt they never left the Union. It was more of a reconciliation as opposed to a reconstruction. Very different mindset, and the radicals actually broke ranks. They stood up their own convention in 1864. They didn't nominate Abraham Lincoln. They nominated John Fremont. So Lincoln actually broke away from the Republican Party, formed his own party. It was called the National Union Party, which came into existence in 1864. It met in convention in Baltimore in June of that year. Lincoln nominated quickly as President of the United States. The question would be, who's the VP nominee going to be? Well, Hamlin had been Lincoln's vice president the first go-around, but he was too close to the radicals, and so he was not really considered by the National Union folks. Lincoln himself, as was custom of the day, did not get involved in the vice presidential selection. That was almost always left up to the delegates at these conventions. So who did they turn to? Well, they wanted someone who could help unite the country. And for that, they thought, how about a Southerner? A Democrat, someone who could unite with Lincoln, who had been loyal to the Union, loyal to the president. Well, this had Andrew Johnson written all over it. And sure enough, Johnson was nominated for the position. He got the most votes on the first ballot. It was made unanimous right after that. And all of a sudden, Andrew Johnson was the candidate, the nominee for Vice President of the United States. Well, this was obviously a big deal to him. His reaction was, I accept the nomination on principle. Be the consequences what they may. I will do what I believe to be my duty. I'm still a Democrat in the strictest meaning of the term. I am for putting down the rebellion because it is a war against democracy. I believe that man is capable of self-government, whether he is a laborer, a shoemaker, a tailor, or a grocer. And I hold with Jefferson that government was made for the convenience of man and not for the government. He then concluded his remarks. Slavery is dead, and you must pardon me if I do not mourn over its dead body. This is certainly, people in the North were happy to hear these sentiments. Johnson was also humbled by this. Think back to his background. He was born into the poor white community called a mudsill. Had very little to go for, very few prospects. He had no formal education. He worked his way up, learned a craft, became a plebeian tailor, and did well, got into politics. And now he's the nominee for Vice President of the United States. But victory for Lincoln and Johnson was hardly assured. They knew they needed one thing that was going to propel them to victory, and that was a military victory, which seemed elusive in 1864. A lot of fightings, but no breakthrough wins. General Ulysses Grant fighting against Robert E. Lee of the Confederacy in Virginia, locked into really difficult fights, one after another. You've got William Sherman, the Union general, fighting the Confederates down in Georgia, also yet to be heard from whether or not he was going to have a breakthrough victory. They were counting on something to come through to get the momentum back with the electorate and beat off these challengers. And in fact, they got it in early September of 1864 when General Sherman wired that Atlanta is ours and fairly won. The victory in Atlanta was really the final catalyst that propelled Lincoln and Johnson to an overwhelming victory in the Electoral College that fall, won about 90% of the vote. So Abraham Lincoln reelected, and Andrew Johnson is the Vice President-elect of the United States. But Johnson was in no hurry to get to that job. He had a job that he really wanted to finish. He wanted to bring Tennessee all the way back into the Union. To that, he needed to have a new government in place, constitutional amendments to the state government. These were going to be preconditions for getting Tennessee back in. After their secession ordinance had started this whole thing a few years before, Johnson wanted to finish that job. But he still had a military challenge. Nashville, the capital, was actually under siege again. The Confederates, last gasp to try to do something to get victory back into their hands. The Battle of Nashville took place in December of 1864, and it was a solid Union victory. General George Thomas leading the way, and he basically told Johnson afterwards, time is now. Move forward on your new governmental activities here in Tennessee, and that's all Johnson needed to hear. Well, Johnson called together Union loyalists for meetings in early January of 1865, and he wrote out some amendments to the state constitution that he was going to put up for a vote. It included abolishing slavery in the state, forbidding the legislature to ever revive slavery in the state. He wanted to give the right to vote to blacks who had fought on the Union side in the war, and to take away the right to vote from Confederate leaders who were still in the state. Only loyalists were allowed to vote on this plebiscite, so the outcome wasn't in question. In fact, it was nearly unanimous when the final verdicts came in February of 1865, and Johnson was thrilled. He wanted to inform the President of the United States right away that, thank God the tyrant's rod is broken. All is now working well, and if Tennessee is let alone, she will resume all the functions of a state according to the genius and theory of the government. He was elated. Left for Washington shortly thereafter, arrived in late February, resigned his military commission, and received some really interesting praise from the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton. According to Stanton, in one of the darkest hours of the Great Struggle, the government called you from the Senate and from the comparatively safe and easy duties of civil life to place you in front of the enemy and in a position of personal toil and danger perhaps more hazardous than was encountered by any other civil or military officer of the United States. With patriotic promptness, you assumed the post and maintained it under circumstances of unparalleled trials until recent events have brought safety and deliverance to your state and to the integrity of the constitutional union for which you so long and so gallantly periled all that is dear to man on earth. A couple interesting things about these words of praise from Stanton. First of all, they're true. He was a war hero. He had gone into the fight, into the perilous situation, remained loyal throughout the whole time, indefatigable in that fight. And eventually, he was successful in keeping Tennessee, or getting back Tennessee into the Union hands and keeping it there. So these words of praise were accurate. But number two, there's great irony that Edwin Stanton was the one who offered these words of praise, because these two were on a collision course, a bitter collision course that was not that far away. We'll cover that more in a future episode. Well, Inauguration Day rolls around, and it is an inauspicious start for the Vice President of the United States, Andrew Johnson. In fact, it was awful. He was nervous. It was a big day. It was a big deal for him, and he asked the outgoing VP, Hannibal Hamlin, for some whiskey to calm his nerves. Well, Andrew Johnson was not a teetotaler, but he was not a big drinker either, but he drank too much at that moment. Because he had planned to offer just a few words in his remarks upon taking his oath of office. This turned into a humiliating disaster. He moved into an agonizing 17 minutes incoherent stream of consciousness that was mortified to everybody around. The Navy Secretary Gideon Wells said the Vice President-elect made a rambling and strange harangue, was listened to us with pain and mortification by all his friends. Zachariah Chandler, the senator, went even further. The Vice President-elect was too drunk to perform his duties and disgraced himself in the Senate by making a drunken, foolish speech. I was never so mortified in my life. Had I been able to find a hole, I would have dropped through it out of sight. Well, there was one person, fortunately, who didn't really side with this and still felt okay about Andrew Johnson even after this. And that was the president, Abraham Lincoln. A couple days later, Lincoln said, I have known Andy Johnson for many years. He made a bad slip the other day, but you need not be scared. Andy ain't a drunkard. Seemed like Lincoln, who had also, of course, inaugurated on the same day, right after Johnson, on the outside of the Capitol, in front of a much larger crowd, gave a much more important speech in which he talked about the South, talking about malice toward none with charity for all. Well, those words apparently also applied to his vice president. Charity for all, including Andrew Johnson, about this little slip-up in his drunken speech. Well, Johnson, after this, was humiliated. He laid low, at least for a couple of weeks, but things were moving quickly. The Union Army was on the attack. They captured the Confederate capital in Richmond, Virginia, and Johnson actually was invited by Lincoln to come down and see it and join in those festivities. That was a little bit of a coming out for him. He enjoyed that. He certainly enjoyed when General Lee surrendered to General Grant just a few days later, and it seemed like the war was at least about to end. Johnson is back in Washington, D.C., the night of April the 14th. And he is roused from his sleep by a friend pounding on his door. This is Leonard Farwell, who had been at the theater that evening. He had gone to Ford's Theater to see the play Our American Cousin. And he was racing back to tell Andrew Johnson what happened in the theater that night, that the president had been shot and it looked like he was dying. Well, Johnson was certainly shaken by this news, but then it got even more real for him as a bunch of soldiers showed up. Major James O'Byrne showed up with a detachment of troops because it turned out that Lincoln wasn't the only one attacked that night. Secretary of State William Seward was also attacked in his bed, feared to be a mortal injury that he had taken upon. Nobody really knew what this conspiracy was going to lead to. Was Johnson in danger as well? There was chaos and some panic. What did Johnson want to do? He tried to calm down. He wanted to see for himself. Was Lincoln going to survive? So he ventured out into the streets, ended up at William Petersen's house, which is right across the street from Ford's Theater, where Lincoln's body had been taken. Lincoln's body laying in a back bedroom. It was clear almost immediately that Lincoln was not going to survive, and Johnson left pretty quickly to head back to the Kirkwood Hotel, where his room was, where he was back in his own room. Well, he knew it was over for good for Lincoln when the bells across the city started to toll around 7:30 that morning on April the 15th. Very shortly thereafter, he got the official word from the cabinet. The Chief Justice, Salmon showed up, and by 10 o'clock, Andrew Johnson was taking the oath of office to become the new president of the United States. He offered a few remarks. He said, I have long labored to ameliorate and elevate the condition of the great mass of the American people. Toil and an honest advocacy of the great principles of free government have been my lot. The duties have been mine, the consequences God's. This has been the foundation of my political creed. Well, that was all fine. But this was now a whole new world. The president had been assassinated. A broken country needed to be put back together, and all eyes were on Andrew Johnson, the 17th president of the United States. That is Andrew Johnson and Lincoln's second VP from the life of Andrew Johnson. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.